Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Just a few reminders while we're waiting for everyone to get logged in. Your mics are muted and the videos are shut off. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions, and you will receive a follow-up email this week with a link to the recorded webinar and a PDF of today's presentation. And today our presenter has asked that we answer questions at the end. So feel free to put those questions in as they come up, and we will have time hopefully for some questions and answers at the end of today's presentation. At this time, I would like to introduce Thomas Renwick from Michigan State University as our presenter today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will let you take over and share yours.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Let me begin that process here. And I'm going to take myself off of camera while I do this as well. And I'm assuming that you can still see the look for your acknowledgement, Heather. You can still see the slide set, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So good afternoon. My name is Tom Renwick, and I'm currently the director of the Health Policy Unit at Michigan State University's Institute for Health Policy. Before I joined the Institute, I spent more than 30 years working at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and its predecessors, which included MDCH and the Department of Mental Health. MSU IHP has been assisting the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services with some of the work that they're doing with regards to complying with the Home and Community-Based Services Final Rule. And we were the primary information gatherer for settings that were originally flagged for heightened scrutiny when the process kicked off. Back in early April, Lindia Duramity asked if I'd be able to provide an HCBS overview for the ARC monthly webinar series. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk with you about home and community-based services and the final rule. I think Heather already told you this, but your microphones have been turned off, but the Q&A feature has been enabled to post any questions that you may have. So today's presentation, we're scheduled for an hour. I think my portion, my actual presentation will probably last around 40-45 minutes or so, which gives us some time, leaves us some time to go through questions as well. If you think of a question during the webinar, please submit it using the Q&A feature. Lindia told me that today's webinar audience would include a variety of community mental health service program staff and prepaid inpatient health plan staff, potentially some individuals who are being served and families, advocates and other providers. I'm sure that most of you have at least some familiarity with the home and community-based services and the rule set, but I think it's helpful to start out by providing a bit of a history and overview on the home and community-based services requirements. After that, I'll talk about MSU's role in the first generation heightened scrutiny process, share some of what we learned, and then talk about some other updates in future home and community-based services oversight activities. And I'm going to start with a little bit of background and history on home and community-based services and the final rule, and share what I believe to be the intent of the rule set. By way of background and some HCBS history, I suspect that parts of this is going to seem like ancient history to some of today's webinar participants, but I'm guessing that at least a few of you have been working in the field as long as I have, and if you're like me, it will feel like some of these things just happened yesterday when they actually started 40 years ago. And I'd start off by saying that home and community-based services are not new, right? The Healthcare Financing Administration, which is now known as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, first made home and community-based services available to states using 1915C waiver authority back in 1983. You all likely know that home and community-based services provide opportunities for persons who are eligible for Medicaid to receive services in their own home or in the community rather than in institutions or other isolating settings. Michigan began providing home and community-based services back in 1987 with the Habilitation Supports Waiver. Home and community-based services is still a component of that and other waiver programs administered by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Programs that provide home and community-based services serve a variety of different population groups, including persons with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities, persons with mental illnesses, and persons with physical disabilities. Services such as community living supports, skill building assistance, and supported employment are all examples of home and community-based services. CMS officially promulgated the Home and Community-Based Services Final Rule Set back in January 2014 in volume 79, number 11 of the Federal Register. And for whatever reason, I still have my original printed copy of the Federal Register when that first came out. Now you can find the rule set as well as other helpful home and community-based services resources using the following link. And when you click on that link, or when you receive the copy of the PowerPoint or the actual link, when you click on that or paste it in your web browser, there's a whole slew of information that's available on that site that CMS has out there, including guidance documents, questions and answers, all sorts of information. It's a very, very robust web page that has lots of information. If you haven't been on there before and checked that out, that's something that you definitely are going to want to do. As far as intent of the home and community-based services rule set, my attempt to summarize the intent in a snapshot would go something along the lines of, I think the rule set is intended to ensure that individuals receiving home and community-based services have the same choices and opportunities to exercise autonomy as you and me, and are given the supports necessary to implement the choices that they make. So how do home and community-based services help foster, develop, and support individual independence and connection to the community? How are individuals helped and supported to make meaningful choices about their lives and community participation? How are individuals assisted with fully integrating into their community in a manner that fits with their interests and desires, and in a way that provides opportunities for connecting with other people within the community who aren't receiving services? CMS, and implementing the final rule set, wants to ensure that services such as community living supports, skill building, and supported employment, services that are paid for with home and community-based services dollars, are in fact delivered in a way that supports individual choice, independence, and affords full connection with the community. So now I'll transition a bit to kind of activities that are being done to help assure compliance with the home and community-based services rules. And there are lots of different players and lots of different roles with regard to ensuring compliance. So you see in the first bullet point that there are roles played in this by providers, case managers, support coordinators, as well as other community mental health service program, PIHP, and MDHHS staff members. Many settings have been required to implement corrective actions to address portions of the rule set where they were found out of compliance. And then some settings were flagged for heightened scrutiny. And maybe I'll take a couple minutes to talk about that there have been a lot of settings that have been required to develop and implement corrective action plans to address portions of the home and community-based services rule set where they were found to be out of compliance. And then there are a group of settings that were flagged for heightened scrutiny. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, but you should understand that the corrective action plan process and the heightened scrutiny process are really separate things that could be taking place simultaneously for a given setting. So let's talk about heightened scrutiny and MSU's role in that heightened scrutiny process. Based on survey work that Wayne State University helped the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services with, about 2,400 individuals and 870 settings across the state were initially flagged for heightened scrutiny. In essence, this meant that one or more of the survey responses triggered a need for clarification and additional information gathering about the setting and the individuals they served. This went beyond plan of correction activities that could have been also taking place simultaneously. MDHHS contracted with MSU IHP to gather additional information on the settings that were flagged for heightened scrutiny. Some settings were able to be removed from the heightened scrutiny process if the survey responses had incorrectly answered on the grounds questions. And these were questions that were survey questions that were meant to determine or identify if a setting was located on the grounds of an institutional type setting like a hospital or nursing home. So if a setting incorrectly answered that question and said, hey, we're on the campus of a hospital, and we were able to clarify that they were not, in fact, on the grounds of a hospital, then they could be removed from heightened scrutiny based on finding out that they weren't on the grounds and they didn't have an on the grounds issue. Some other settings were removed from the heightened scrutiny listings as a result of settings confirmation work that IHP did with the Community Mental Health Service Program heightened scrutiny leads. And this typically involves situations where individuals perhaps had moved or were no longer receiving services from the original surveyed provider. Ultimately, MSU IHP wound up completing data collection reports for about 600 settings across the state. And MSU's role here was really not to assess a setting's compliance with the home and community-based services requirements and make a thumbs up or down decision, but to really gather additional relevant information for Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and their heightened scrutiny review committee's consumption and decision-making. So MSU reviewed an enormous number of administrative policies and procedures, individual plans of service, and clinical assessments, as well as looked at myriad types of other documentation completed by service provider settings as we did our heightened scrutiny information gathering. We spent hours talking with setting staff members and administrators, case managers, and community mental health service program heightened scrutiny leads, as well as interviews with home and community-based services recipients. And so now I can talk a little bit about what we learned through that process. All of the information gathering and reporting gave us a pretty good sense of how CMHSPs and settings were documenting the provision of home and community-based services and compliance with the home and community-based services requirements. This slide is a bit of stating the obvious. We interacted with some staff members who were very knowledgeable about home and community-based services requirements and others who were not. Sometimes documentation did a great job describing practices that demonstrated home and community-based services compliance, and other times documentation was incomplete, missing, or not on point. Sometimes our information gathering and interviews identified practices that were clearly non-compliant with home and community-based services requirements. So let me break down some of the documentation issues that we ran into and provide a bit of background and suggestions for each of these areas. And I'm going to start off by talking about individual's choice of setting. So the individual and the choice of, has a choice of where to live and needs to have options for non-disability specific settings. And that is not always documented. This is a requirement of the HCBS rules. A disability specific setting is a setting that only provides services to persons with a disability. we did not run across a non-disability specific residential setting for any of the heightened scrutiny work that we did. So in other words, all of the settings that were on heightened scrutiny that we looked at, all of the residential settings, were disability specific settings. Now, the HCBS rule, as I mentioned before, requires that individuals have a choice as to whether they want to live in a disability specific setting. Lots of individuals who receive home and community-based services have been living in a disability-specific setting for years and years, long before the final rule was issued. And maybe I could clarify that the HCBS rules don't mandate that individuals have to live in a non-disability specific setting in order to receive or continue to receive home and community-based services, but they have to have options about non-disability settings presented to them. Now, many of the residential settings that we completed heightened scrutiny information gathering on had very detailed practices for filling vacancies when they existed in their settings. And the processes that they had in place allowed individuals to visit the home, to share meals with prospective housemates, and sometimes to even have an overnight visit to the home before making the decision whether to live there or not. Many settings also had formats for asking and documenting the individual's satisfaction with the setting, their happiness with roommates, etc. What was generally lacking was documentation that the individual had any choice to live in a non-disability specific setting. Now, the individual's continued choice to live in a disability specific setting should be documented regularly. We often found that this was, again, indirectly and incompletely addressed only by documenting the individual's satisfaction with the current residential placement. The initial options and choice of where an individual will live is largely an area that will need to be addressed by documentation that's probably initially collected by the CMHSP Placement Committee, a customer services area, or perhaps by a case manager or supports coordinator, and included in an area of the individual plan of service. That documentation is something that folks are going to want to continue to bring forward in the plan of service, so it isn't lost over time, and that you're continuing to demonstrate the individual has an ongoing choice. The next slide, I'm going to talk about some areas where the individual plan of service content could frequently be improved. Now, some of the better individual plan of service formats contained a distinct home and community-based services section that allowed many of the home and community-based services standards to be reviewed annually with the participant and guardian. And this was a clear and consolidated way to help document compliance with a number of home and community-based services requirements. There were also many instances where the individual plans of service documentation could be improved to support compliance with home and community-based services requirements. These areas included documenting the individual's ability to come and go from the setting when they choose, with or without support. And this is an area critical to supporting individual choice and autonomy. There were many examples where this was not addressed in the individual's plan of service. Some of the better individual plans of service clearly documented how individuals exercise decision-making and choice about leaving the setting, and described the specific level of staff support and supervision the individual needed to leave the home and to go out into the community. The best ones contained more detailed descriptions that were tailored to the individual's needs to participate in more specific community activities, such as grocery shopping, restaurant selection, food ordering, and what support individuals needed to make purchases. What types of staff assistance and support are needed for an individual to make their own shopping choices and handle funds. The best plans of service identified that type of support and what the individual needed. The individual's freedom of movement within the setting and their ability to access food and snacks and food preparation materials is important to document in the individual plan of service as well. Any restrictions must be clearly documented in the individual plan of service and you must obtain Behavior Management Review Committee approval for those types of restrictions as well. Satisfaction with the setting. The individual plan of service is a logical place where the individual satisfaction with the setting can be documented on a regular basis. Community living support services. Identifying where CLS services were to be provided was often missing in the plan of service. Frequently, the methodologies for community living support related goals, such as increasing an individual's independence in areas such as shopping, menu planning, and money management, were silent on where those CLS services were to be provided and didn't include how those activities would be worked on in the home and out in the community. Oftentimes, setting staff members were unable to identify what skill acquisition or independence promoting activities were taking place out in the community. This made it appear that all CLS was provided in the setting and doesn't really demonstrate or reflect integration into the community. Choice of roommates. We touched on this in the previous slide, but again, the individual plan of service is another place where the individual's choice of roommates can be documented. Employment opportunities is another specific area that the home and community-based services final rule requires be addressed. The plan of service should clearly address employment opportunities. Is the consumer interested in exploring employment options? Does documentation support that they have opportunities to seek employment and work in competitive integrated settings? Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the types of documentation that settings are typically maintaining. So beyond the plan of service, there are other types of documentation that settings providing home and community-based services need to document to help demonstrate compliance with the home and community-based services final rule. I'm going to largely focus on access and participation with the community here. And as a starting framework, it'd be good to shift our focus from individuals going into the community to promoting opportunities and helping individuals to be integrated or part of the community. Being part of a community involves more than just going somewhere. It gives us opportunities to connect to others and to build relationships. Accordingly, documentation should not just focus on where someone went, but also include information about the individual's interactions with persons not receiving services. Activity calendars. They can be a very effective way to document what opportunities an individual has to go out into the community, but activity calendars alone are insufficient to demonstrate community integration. We saw lots of activity calendars during our heightened scrutiny information gathering. Sometimes the activity calendars listed an activity without identifying where the activity took place. We had examples of movie night, game night, bingo, etc., where the calendar described activities that took place and you couldn't tell whether they were taking place in the home or if they were activities that were taking place out in the community. One thing settings may want to consider is keeping one activity calendar for in-home activities and one for out-of-home activities, but at a minimum, you need to make sure that the calendars clearly identify which activities took place outside the home. Another issue with relying on activity calendars alone is that activity calendars frequently identified an activity without identifying who took part in them. We saw a number of examples where progress notes, shift notes, and activity logs did a great job documenting individuals' opportunities to go out into the community and to interact with individuals not receiving services. The best of these not only documented what the activity was and where it took place, but included information about the nature and the extent of the individual's interaction with persons not receiving services during the activity. So how did the individual, when they're out at a restaurant, interact with the wait staff? Did they greet them by name? Do they know who they each other are? How do they interact with people when they're shopping? What are the opportunities for people when they're engaged in community recreation opportunities to interact with others? It's important to document that those opportunities are happening for people and what the nature of their interaction with folks who aren't receiving services is. Some settings were not documenting if an individual refused an opportunity to go out into the community. And it's important to keep in mind that documenting an occasional refusal on the part of an individual demonstrates that they had an opportunity and they were also able to exercise autonomy and choice and decide that they didn't want to go. Repeated refusals may require some evaluation on the nature of the opportunities that are being declined and the need to change or expand the types of activities being offered the individual. House meetings can be very helpful in supporting that individuals have meaningful choices about activities in the home and in the community when they're documented in a way that captures individuals' feedback and choices. Far less helpful are the house meeting documentation that's limited to check-off boxes that identify who attended and what was picked from a limited pre-established list of activities. And then a quick note on house rules. We frequently saw resident care agreements with a box checked off that indicates the individual was given a copy of house rules. By now, everyone should be aware that you cannot have house rules in place. We recommended that BCAL revise the annual resident care agreement form to delete the checkbox about house rules and to add a new section about restrictions or limitations needed for another individual living in the home. Until that change occurs, if you're completing resident care agreements, you probably just want to mark the house rules box as not applicable. Let me talk a bit about individual choice about where other services are provided. And the individual's choice of providers is not always well documented in the individual plan of service or elsewhere. And this is not limited to the services provided by home staff or staff out in the community who are working with the individual, but really extends to the individual's choices about who's going to provide them other services, such as doctor or dentist, eye doctor, laboratory services, podiatry, physical therapy, occupational therapy, immunizations, and even hair care. It can be normal for persons without disabilities to receive some of those services in their own home because it's convenient for them and it reflects their choice. When individuals who are living in settings that are providing home and community-based services receive all or most of those types of services in the setting, it looks similar to how those services are provided to individuals who are living in institutional settings. That type of service provision doesn't help support that individuals are integrated into the community. If an individual does choose to receive some of those services in the setting, documentation should clearly support that, number one, it's their choice, and number two, that they have an ability to choose to receive those services from a different provider or in a community setting. So very quickly, I'm going to talk about the status of past heightened scrutiny review activities. All of the settings that remained on heightened scrutiny after the settings confirmation work was done between IHP and the Community Mental Health Service Program heightened scrutiny leads, we collected additional information on those settings and developed reports and entered those things into a database, and the reports were forwarded to the department for their review and for access by the Heightened Scrutiny Review Committee. The department also went through a public comment period for all of those settings and collected the public comment, any public comment that was provided for those heightened scrutiny flagged settings. So as of now, those settings have now been forwarded to CMS for their review and decision-making. And the department is expecting at some point in time that CMS will reach back out to the department and ask for copies of the information that was collected that demonstrate the additional information gathering and the compliance with the setting for the home and community-based services rules. And that we'll have to provide that information to CMS probably on a sampling basis. And after that, then we're hopeful that CMS will then provide feedback on the status of all of those settings. And we know that this has taken a very, very long time to play out. But hopefully we're nearing the end of that process for that first wave of settings that were flagged for heightened scrutiny. As far as future home and community-based service compliance activities, the department is still in the process of solidifying how they're going to continue to assess for home and community-based services compliance moving forward. So there will be a continuation of a process that they started. They're calling this their MDHHS Provisional Consultation process. This is a process that will be implemented for new settings or settings that are currently on heightened scrutiny or just recently got flagged for heightened scrutiny, but weren't part of the batch that got submitted to CMS for approval. And also settings that have restrictive or setting-wide restrictive policies. And the way that this provisional consultation process works is that provisional approvals are requested to the department by the PIHP, heightened scrutiny lead, once they determine that they are supportive of a settings request for approval. And then the provisional approval process would occur between MDHHS and the PIHP leads. Providers or settings with concerns would work through the PIHPs with whom they are contracted to have any concerns addressed. And then settings that come into the heightened scrutiny list going forward are going to be reviewed to determine whether the heightened scrutiny status is appropriate and whether this is an instance where the setting will move through the heightened scrutiny process and a provisional review will be required prior to placing a new participant in the setting. So the department, like I said earlier, is still in the process of solidifying a bit what they're going to do with settings that are flagged for heightened scrutiny after that first wave that I talked about earlier. In all likelihood, there will be some sort of notification process that goes directly to the setting. And then the setting will be told what documentation that they need to gather and make available. And then someone from the PIHP or CMHSP will contact the setting, collect that information, and then submit it to a portal that's operated by the department. And then we'll provide a summary of that information for the department at their request. And then that's slightly different than the way the heightened scrutiny process went for the first iteration. So a little bit more about ongoing compliance and monitoring and what to expect. The department wants to let everyone know that assessments for home and community-based services compliance is going to continue to occur on a regular basis. They're still determining the frequency that those things are going to take place. And the assessments are going to continue to focus on the rights and the freedoms of participants. And they're going to be pretty consistent with the surveys that you received in the past. There hasn't been a lot of change with regard to the original surveys that were developed by Wayne State University. There have been some substantive changes in terms of how those survey responses are reviewed and analyzed and used, and what triggers heightened scrutiny and what triggers other kind of monitoring activities. Providers, speaking of surveys, providers are required to complete home and community-based services surveys, and those who do not are deemed to be out of compliance. The department was also telling folks that they should expect home and community-based services compliance to be part of the site review processes that get implemented by the department's site review team, and also get undertaken by PIHP and CMHSP in terms of their either quality assurance activities or their provider monitoring activities. And that the monitoring moving forward is going to continue to include review of relevant provider policies, handbooks, etc. So a couple of resource documents, and the first one is MDHHS's Home and Community-Based Services webpage. And this webpage contains a lot of information. It contains the joint guidance document that they developed with Lara. It has a listing of the heightened scrutiny settings that were submitted to CMS already. It has contact information for the PIHP, Home and Community-Based Services leads, and the Community Mental Health Service Program, heightened scrutiny leads. It has information on how to become or maintain compliance with the Home and Community-Based Services rule. There are provider readiness tools. There is a corrective action plan guidance table, frequently asked question documents. There's a document that describes guardianship in the Home and Community-Based Services rule document. It also includes communications from CMS to the state of Michigan and examples of the Home and Community-Based Services surveys that they get sent out. And then the second page is one that's duplicated from the one I showed you early on in the slide set. And again, that is a very helpful webpage that is maintained by CMS, where you can find actual copies of the final rules, the response to questions that they got when they were in the process of promulgating the rules. Sometimes the answers that CMS provided in response to a question can give you greater insight into actually what they're requiring than the language of the rule set itself. So that's a helpful document for you to look at if you've got particular questions about compliance in a specific area. Well, I know I went through things very quickly, and I think now we have an opportunity for Heather to help me out and maybe go through some of the questions that were asked in the chat if we have some.
Yeah, so let's give people just a few minutes to type in any questions that they have. But so far, we do have one question in the Q&A.
Okay.
Is there a public list of settings under heightened scrutiny?
Yeah, so I think if you get on the web page that I provided, the department's web page that was on that the second to the last slide, they have a list of all of the heightened scrutiny settings that were submitted to CMS. Now that will have, in essence, everybody who was in the first wave or the first generation, as we're calling it a bit. There are some other settings, a lot smaller number, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 100 settings that are on heightened scrutiny because of survey responses or failure to respond to a survey. And there was not a way to do a heightened scrutiny review and get those done in a way that in a timing that could get them to CMS with the original batch. And so there's a smaller second batch that will need to be worked through. And I don't know that those are included yet on the on the listing on the MDHHS webpage. So, but the webpage will have the entirety of the kind of the first round of settings that got flagged for heightened scrutiny. I don't think, Heather, I'm not sure if it will have even the ones that were flagged and then subsequently removed. I don't know how, if the list is a cleaned up list of the ones. Well, if it's just limited to the ones that were sent to CMS, it won't include some settings that were initially flagged for heightened scrutiny and then were removed because they were clearly not on the grounds of of a hospital or an intermediate care facility for the intellectually and developmentally disabled or a hospital. So I think settings that came off the heightened scrutiny list wouldn't be on that listing. It would just be a listing of the settings that were flagged for heightened scrutiny that were sent to or forwarded on to CMS.
Okay. And a follow-up question to that was, can we see corrective action plans?
Well, when someone says, can we see it, I'm assuming that someone who doesn't have privy or access to them today, right? So the corrective action plans would be something that was developed, between the setting and the community mental health service program or the prepaid inpatient health plan, and then subsequently, forwarded to the department. I think you could reach out if you had interest in seeing what those corrective actions, were. I think you could reach out to one of those players and ask them for copies of those documents.
Okay, thank you. That is all the questions that we have right now, but just give everyone just a few minutes to see if
Sure.
anyone wants to type in a question here. And remember, we are using the Q&A function. So I'm not seeing any questions popping in. So we can go ahead and in today's webinar, oh wait, we do have one. That always happens. Understanding the HCBS rule, do not prefer congregated settings in a specialized AFC home located next door to another AFC home. Is that automatically heightened scrutiny?
Well, part of the answer to that question depends on whether the same provider is operating the adjoining home and what the nature of the shared supports are across those two settings. So it's not uncommon, and we found this a lot in kind of the first wave, that settings would say, yeah, we're not the only home in our neighborhood that provides services to folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We know that there's another one, across the street and 3 doors down that's run by another provider. And sometimes homes were developed that way years and years and years ago before the fair housing laws changed. There was difficulty in opening group homes in neighborhoods. And sometimes if you had one in a neighborhood, it was easier to open a second one, right? So it's not automatic that a setting who's located to another setting that also happens to be providing services to folks with disabilities would be automatically placed on heightened scrutiny. But if you run into instances where the same provider operates homes that are adjoin each other, and there's potentially sharing of staff or sharing of other resources across the two settings, the more that arrangement looks like the kind of the old institutional cottage settings where you had multiple residential settings that were set up in close proximity to each other, then the more problematic that arrangement is with complying with the home and community-based services rule set.
Okay. And a follow-up to that question,
Yep.
What about large congregated facilities like the St. Louis Center? Will they pass heightened scrutiny?
Well, heightened scrutiny again, in terms of the additional information that's being gathered. I mean, the department has looked at those large congregate, settings, and they've looked at them across the state. So there's a number of them, right? It's not simply the St. Louis Center, but there's other settings that are kind of similar in some respect or another. So the department has looked at those settings and has tried to determine, are the settings, is it problematic the way the settings currently operate with, can they demonstrate compliance with the home and community-based services requirements? Is it a setting that's set up and is doing things in a way that meets the needs of the individuals that they're serving, but doesn't comply with home and community services requirements? Is there a need to look at potentially other funding arrangements that don't draw down federal Medicaid dollars, home and community-based services dollars? So I think the short answer to that question is that they're not through the process yet, so to stay tuned, but that there's going to be probably options for settings to take and for service providers and the PIHPs and the department to take to figure out what needs to happen for folks to meet their needs most effectively.
Okay. And the next question is, any ideas any idea on how many sites are closing as they will not be able to meet the final rule?
We experienced, I think, out of the, I threw out the number, maybe 800 settings at the outset of the ones that we did, out of the gate, or the original ones. There were a handful of providers that said, hey, we're no longer going to provide home and community-based services to the individuals living in our home. By and large, it was a very small number, and it really was focused on maybe individuals that weren't receiving very much or very many home and community-based services to begin with, right? So there's a few settings across the state where maybe somebody was placed in a setting and they had a half hour or an hour maybe of community living supports authorized in their plan of service. And then when the provider took a look at how their setting operated, and I guess the hoops that maybe they would have to jump through to continue to receive those dollars, and looking at that in conjunction with what the individual's actual need was for home and community-based services, there were a few instances where they made the decision, we can continue to provide services, what we've been provided to the individual. We don't have to bill home and community-based services, and then we don't have to, kind of worry really about technically complying with the home and community services rule set. But we didn't hear much from settings that were providing services to people who were getting a lot of home and community-based services, and we're serving a lot of those individuals. We didn't run into cross settings who said, I want all 4 or 5 or 6 of the people that I'm serving to move elsewhere because I'm not willing to to make some changes to demonstrate compliance with the rule set. So we really didn't experience that too much in that first round.
Thank you. The next question says, you mentioned that CLS could take place in the house or in the home and community by different providers. Usually if you bill H2016 CLS, you shouldn't bill H2015 under Medicaid. Do you mean AFC home or personal private home in this context?
Yeah, and I probably at some point I probably should have dedicated a bigger portion of my life to memorizing those HCBS codes, but I do not have them memorized. I think one of the H2016 versus H2015, one might be a per diem CLS rate, and the other might be an individual rate. When I talked about the billing of CLS, that they could take place in the home and in the community, I was really talking about the services provided by a residential setting, right? So if I'm a residential provider and I'm providing home and community-based services to an individual who's living in the home I'm operating, and I'm working with that individual on money management. And there could be a time during the course of the day when the individual's in the home, and I'm working with that person on recognizing money, exchanging money, counting money, all of those things. And then I'm also working on that same goal out in the community with the individual. If we're out at a bank, for example, or if he's out at a restaurant. So you're working on CLS. It's just that you're not exclusively working on it in the home setting. The methodology for providing those community living supports should be supporting when you're working on those things in the home, and when residential staff are working on helping the person with further skill acquisition and training out in the community.
Thank you, Tom. And we have one more question. When people with disability are living in the same neighborhood home, is there a limit to how many roommates can have disabilities and still be considered home and community based?
So the short answer is going to be you can still get to compliance with the home and community based services rule set if you're a disability specific setting. There's just other factors that get looked at, right? So in essence, if it was a group home setting, that was serving five individuals, and all five people had disabilities. That is really not an issue that would automatically preclude you the setting from becoming compliant with the rule set. There'd be other things that would be looked at, but starting out, individuals all need to have choices about where they want to live, and whether or not they're choosing to live in a disability specific setting or a non-disability specific setting. I think I answered that, Heather. I don't know if it was as clear as I would have hoped, but.
Yes, thank you, Tom. And if you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to type those in the Q&A, and we will give Tom some time to answer those. So again, if anyone has any more questions or follow-up questions, please type those in the Q&A now. And I'm not seeing any other questions or follow-up to the previous questions. So we are okay to end today's webinar. And I just wanted to thank you, Tom, for agreeing to present at today's webinar and for your expertise in this subject.
Absolutely, you're more than welcome.
Thank you. And remember to everyone that we will send out the follow-up email with a link to the recording and a PDF of today's presentation. And those can also be found on our website at the ARC Michigan. All right, thank you, everyone, and have a great day.